We got a real time crunch here this afternoon, so we're going to really just try and get started right on time and finish on time. Welcome to this third session here. I'm Jim Kolbe, co-chair of the Bretton Woods Committee, and I feel it's a real treat to be on this platform with two people that I have such great respect for and have worked with for so long, Ambassador Carla Hills, with NAFTA as our USTR, and the Inter-American, so many different things that we've worked on together. And Jim Bacchus, who I served with in Congress and has, of course, been a real champion on trade issues. So we're going to get right into it. To borrow a phrase from Charles Dickens, it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. It's certainly the best of times in that there's more going on trade around the world and in this country than I think we've seen in a long, long time. I mean, trade is on the front pages of everything, it seems almost every single day. It's the worst of times in that we seem to see the fraying and the shredding of some of the bilateral agreements that we've had, and also the failure of some of the multilateral institutions. So we have a lot going on right now on the area of trade. So I'm going to start with this general question and include it in a specific one that I would like you both to address. How do you see the future, the agenda going forward in the next few years, couple of years on trade? We have with USMCA, with China, with Brexit, with Europe. The specific question that I want to ask is Congress going to get the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 done or not? Or are we going to see it enacted? So trade in general and specifically about USMCA. Carla, we'll start with you.
Did you bring a crystal ball?
No, but you did, so I know you're going to give the answer.
I think you say the best of times and the worst of times. I think this is the most uncertain of times that I've ever experienced. On the U.S. agenda for trade, we have not only the agreement with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA, that is going to have real challenges. I will be surprised if it is approved 2019, but I hope it is. We have the negotiations with a range of others, including China. Our objections or our objectives with China, many of them are quite legitimate. I do not applaud the fact that we didn't join hands with nations around the world that are experiencing the same problems that we experience, and work with China, which actually it would be a win-win for them, because as their economy slows down, as they are funneling credit to state-owned enterprises that are not performing and starving private sector that is producing jobs, GDP, productivity, it would make a difference. So we kind of like playing tennis and brought the wrong racket. And then we have, I just read this morning that Japan is sending their economic minister, and we will start those negotiations that were noticed to our Congress in October on the 16th through the 17th of April. But then we also have the negotiations that we have noticed to our Congress with Europe. And I think that the latter two, Japan and Europe, are going to be an uphill run. But none of the others that I've mentioned are going to be a downhill breeze. So be ready for a couple of years of real trauma. And the problem is that the rhetoric that surrounds them and some of the actions we take have an adverse effect on our multilateral institutions. Jim knows more about that than anyone. And perhaps I should stop there since our time is limited. I could go on and on.
We all could. Jim, the trade agenda going forward in USMCA, Carla, you said you'd be surprised it was in 2019. You think it's even possible in 2020, an election year, to pass it. So yeah. I'll pass that question on to Jim here, USMCA, if it doesn't get done this year. But then the general question.
Well, the political conventional wisdom would say that if we don't pass it this year, we won't pass it next year. And I think I agree with that conventional wisdom. We were all three much involved in passing the NAFTA, and we're all supporters of it. I'm not particularly impressed with the revisions that President Trump has negotiated in the NAFTA, nor did I support the way in which he bullied our trading partners into those revisions. That said, I would vote for it if it came up, because it would be certainly better than not having a NAFTA, which is perhaps one of the possibilities. It does disturb me, though, that we're moving away from freer trade in the NAFTA toward more managed trade. And I think that's a move in the wrong direction. It's typical, in my view, of what I see as the fault at the bottom of the Trump trade policy. It's not a policy in favor of free trade, despite what the Secretary told us earlier today. It's a policy in favor of managed trade. And I don't think managed trade works. It won't work for us. It's not going to work over a longer period of time for China or for anyone else. But I'm not sure this is being debated. Even the very finest journalists we have tend to follow the blow-by-blow rather than looking at the bigger picture. There are some exceptions. Some of them are here today. But I'm afraid that we're drifting toward a policy in which we want to dictate economic outcomes in the marketplace. And the principal difference between the two parties that we have in the United States is that they just want to dictate the outcomes in different ways. So I find myself agreeing, sadly, with Carla on the politics. I don't think she's happy with her prediction herself, but there's where we are.
Are we moving away from multilateralism? I mean, this goes back really before this current administration. We saw the faltering of the multilateral rounds, the Uruguay round, the first rounds since GATT was created that failed, that wasn't able to succeed. Are we moving steadily away from any kind of multilateral to you said managed trade, but to bilateral agreements? You think that's the future where we're going to see? We're not going to see multilateral agreements?
We have seen a great multiplicity of bilateral agreements around the world, and it is harder to bring more people to the table, but you also get more back. When you put something on the table that Jim wants, I don't have to pay for it. And when he puts something on the table you want, I get two things. So you really get a better agreement with more. I'm a fervent multilateralist. I think that that is the best outcome. But I do believe that a great plurilateral agreement can be a model for multilateral improvement. And I say that because you mentioned the Uruguay round, and it cratered in Europe in about 1990. And we began the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement in June of '91, finished it in August of '92. President Bush Sr. signed it in December of '92, and President Clinton got it through our Congress in '93, and it took force in January 1 of '94. And within 4 months, all then 126 trade ministers came back to the table and borrowed from the North American Free Trade Agreement the protections for intellectual property, the protections for investment, the dispute settlement mechanism, the services sector. And we had never had those before. That upgraded the GATT and created the WTO, copy of the dispute settlement mechanism. So I do think that a sterling plurilateral agreement can serve an outstanding purpose in the multilateral circumstance in some instances.
Good.
Yes, I agree with Carla. Let me be a bit more philosophical. I was the Bow Forum 2 weeks ago speaking, and one of the questions that was posed there was a similar question. is multilateralism outdated? And I don't think that's the right question. If you talk to ancient historians, if you talk to anthropologists, if you talk to evolutionary biologists, they will tell you that the reason why our species so far has succeeded is because we have been uniquely able among all species to combine imagination and cooperation. I don't think the question about multilateralism, which is simply a word we use for global cooperation, is whether it's outdated. I think the question is whether as a species we are able yet fully to engage in multilateralism. I have always hoped, and I know the two of you have as well, that the multilateralism, the global cooperation we've had in trade, could lead to even more cooperation in trade, but also more global cooperation in other areas of global concern, principally now climate change. And I think the real question is whether we're ready for it. And given climate change, we have to be ready for it. That's the real question we're facing. And at a time when even what we've done multilaterally so far is in jeopardy, and make no mistake about it, it is. It's under attack in many places, but certainly from Washington, D.C. We need to reaffirm our commitment to global cooperation and get serious about it, and soon.
Okay, let's turn to something that's bilateral agreement between China. We heard Secretary Mnuchin earlier today say that they were making progress, but he was understandably very circumspect about any of the details of that. It seems like one of the key issues has been the enforcement. How do we make sure we get enforcement? I'd like each of you to maybe just tell me what you think, what would constitute a really good agreement with China. Do you think it's doable? Is it possible to happen? We'll start with Jim at that end this time.
Well, it depends on what the goals of the administration are. If the goal is to reduce the bilateral goods deficit with China, then that's a silly goal. It makes no economic sense. I don't think we have to explain that here to this audience. Perhaps we need to explain it in the White House. If the goal is to address the structural issues that rightly concern us in the way that China is taking statist approaches, mercantilist approaches, approaches that involve managed trade, then that's the right target. And that's the kind of agreement we should be seeking. If the goal is simply to cut a deal, to look at it transactionally and get some guaranteed slices of the Chinese market in some important sectors of trade, well, that too is managed trade. We don't know what's in this deal yet. 2 points here, and let me make a confession. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a former international judge for the WTO, and I have a bit of a bias in favor of the international rule of law. So take that into account. All the focus here is on this deal between the United States and China bilaterally. But if in this deal, say it's a transactional deal, the Chinese decide that, okay, we'll guarantee that we'll give the U.S. 10% of our market in X product next year. Well, what about the rights of other WTO members who also produce X product? This is a fundamental violation of the most favored nation obligation of non-discrimination. That's the heart of the world trading system. an obligation which we supposedly believe. Do we care about that anymore? And in terms of enforcement, I don't know what's in this draft agreement. Enforcement would be a key to it. But what are we talking about using as a tool of enforcement? The tariffs that the United States has imposed are illegal under international law, period. We're not even claiming a national security defense for these tariffs, and that's a dubious pretext in other places, but that's not even claimed here. Section 301, to the extent that it is illegal under WTO law, is only legal if we use it as we promised we would, exclusively through WTO dispute settlement. Instead, the self-proclaimed tariff man we have as president decided he would take another approach, circumvent the rule of law, and engage in the exercise of leverage by imposing these unilateral tariffs. Well, if we maintain these tariffs in place, they're still illegal. If we reduce part of them and agree to restore them, if the Chinese don't do exactly as we wish, that's still illegal under international law. If the Chinese want to relinquish their WTO rights to us because of our pressure that they should do so, they have that right, in my view. But why would they do that? Why would they do that? I want to see President Xi explain doing that to the Chinese people in a country that suffered from all those unequal treaties imposed on them in the 19th century. So I'm not sure what we're going to get. I do know this: whatever we get, President Trump will say it's the best deal we've ever gotten, and he will declare victory and move on. But unless we address these fundamental structural problems, technology transfer and IP violations and industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies and notifications for all of them, and all these investment performance requirements in a way that's compatible with WTO rules, then we're not going to have a deal that will work, and we'll end up back in the WTO. And I agree with Carla. We should, at the outset, have gone in with our like-minded trading partners and brought these concerns to the WTO as we're required by treaty law to do so.
Carla, comments on the China agreement, or where it may go, or what we may end up with?
I don't disagree with Jim. I think that where we are is that we've certainly captured China's attention. I would not have recommended the manner in which we have done so, but the Congress in China at the beginning of March has passed the foreign investment law. There's a little bit of ambiguity in some of the provisions, but it is a small step forward. They have strengthened the intellectual property rules, which is something that we have been vigorously wanting, and several other measures where they have actually moved in the right direction. I think that I would say that many of the things that we are complaining about need to be fixed in the World Trade Organization. And that is, we don't have rules to deal with state-owned enterprises that are not acting in a market fashion. And so, in fact, we have rules in the WTO that require giving notice when you give a subsidy. And that has been just flaunted. Nobody does that. On designation, am I a underdeveloped country? That is, I get to decide that on my own. And 1/3 of the WTO members have determined that they are developing countries. This doesn't make any sense. In fact, 10 of the 20, G20, have declared that they are developing countries. So we have to get a system that reflects the facts and has enforcement mechanisms. And if the WTO were to pick up on 3 areas that I think it's deficient, one is monitoring what is already agreed to. It doesn't do that. And so half the G20 can just declare whatever they want. It's self-declaratory. That they have to enforce the rules, and the enforcement mechanism is difficult because we don't have rules for the 21st century in many areas, and particularly in intellectual property. What do we do about it? And so those 2 areas of monitoring and enforcement. The third is negotiation. One of the basic precepts of creating the WTO is the ongoing negotiations. And so that would keep it up to date, and also we could bring in the issues that we had. Good news, you know, you started out by saying we have good news and less good news. The good news is that we have Europe, Japan, and the United States trying to work together on kind of an outline of reforms for the WTO that would address some of the concerns. We have Canada that has created a group of, I think, 13, which is trying to address the reforms that are critically needed for the WTO. If these groups would gather together, you almost certainly would have a majority because, and although the WTO is a consensus organization, you need 100%. The fact is that when you are representing like 90% of world GDP, people tend to listen to you. And so I think that there is a path through the thicket, but what we're missing is leadership.
Well, we keep coming back to the WTO, and so I'm going to just shift to that for a second here, because its role. Obviously, Jim, this is something you have a great interest in. We're going to be down to 1 appellate judge by the end of the year. It'll basically cease to function. Is there any hope that we're going to get the appellate system up and running, or is there, as I keep hearing from some people, it's a time to look at a complete reform of the WTO, as perhaps Carla was just suggesting?
Well, I think it needs to be noted that of the 164 members of the WTO, there is only one that is of the view that the appellate body of the WTO has not been doing its job. I know it's conventional wisdom here in Washington, in the media, in both parties. It's in the talking points that the 7 members of the appellate body, as they're supposed to be, we're now down to 3, have routinely overreached. They've routinely added to the obligations in the treaties. They've routinely made things up. I think that's a direct quote from the president. It's certainly a paraphrase. And that the United States has lost almost all the cases that it has brought in the WTO as a consequence. None of this is true. There's not another member of the WTO that feels the appellate body has acted in this way. No one claims perfection for the appellate body. I certainly don't, and I was on it. Any human institution is going to fall short of perfection. But it is a fact also that at last count, the United States had won 86% of the cases it brought to the WTO in the first 24 years of its existence. Now, it's lost a lot of cases in recent years, but this is simply because, I don't want to shock you, the United States routinely refuses to comply with its WTO obligations on trade remedies because it wants to have all the latitude that it wishes to have to be as protectionist as it wants to be, to rig the rules in its own way. And the Trump administration is populated by a lot of protectionist trade lawyers, including my friend Bob Lighthizer, a very highly skilled lawyer, a good guy, but a protectionist, who don't like a system in which there's the rule of law. They prefer the rule of power, and they prefer a system in which the WTO judges will just simply do as the United States wants them to do. And the WTO judges have sworn that they will be independent and impartial. They're required not once but in 2 places in the WTO treaty to be independent and impartial, so they can't be intimidated by anyone, the United States or any other country, and they've refused to be intimidated. So now we have this deadlock in which the United States simply refuses to join the consensus to appoint any more judges, and come the end of the year, as you said, Jim, we'll be down to 1 judge, and then the appellate body won't be able to hear any appeals. We'll have 1 brilliant Chinese judge who will have nothing to do.
So, Jim, I'm kind of getting the impression here today that you may have some disagreements with the current administration about trade. You're not in negotiation with them to become the chief trade advisor to the president, or are you? No, the White House, that's all right, never mind.
Well, there have been several countries that independently have suggested that they would like to nominate me to return to the appellate body.
Well, we think you should.
For the sole purpose of getting the United States to behave and submit a reasonable nominee from the United States.
All right, well,
otherwise, they'd be stuck with me again.
Carla, any other thoughts? You spoke a few moments ago about the WTO, but any other thoughts in particular about this appellate issue? And going forward, is the WTO going to have a role to play?
We need the WTO. It was a great addition to our international trade rules. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, had a system for disputes, but not dispute settlement. And the WTO has done a fabulous job. And as Jim said, the United States has won most of the cases it's initiated. It's also lost most of the cases that were brought against it. But that is true for every single member of the WTO, which shouldn't be surprising.
We've lost a lower percentage than other countries.
That is correct. But it shouldn't be surprising, because if I think you've done something wrong, probably the likelihood is that there's some error there. And so we need to bring it back. As I said, I do think that it can be improved in the dispute settlement in terms of clarity of a term and that sort of thing. But it's going to take like-minded nations, governments, to agree to this. And it takes you back to the beginning of the Bretton Woods organizations, when 23 like-minded nations after World War II said no more of this. We are going to create the economic organizations, the political organizations that maintain stability and encourage prosperity. And we've been blessed for 70 years with the organizations that range from the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and so forth, the WTO now. And we need to maintain and upgrade them. The WTO is 25 years old. There are things that could be changed. The one worry is that it requires a consensus of the 164. That's tough. Hard to get an agreement in this room on a single issue. Somebody's going to step aside. But I do think that if a majority of the nation's GDP, if we could assemble 90% of the world's GDP and set separate rules, even if we were to go into a related plurilateral agreement, which we have done, we have half a dozen plurilateral agreements that are invitations to all others not part of it to join, and they have been successful.
We're going to run out of time, but we're going to stay in that continent, that part of the world where Geneva is, and this last one you can give me a very quick answer if you want there. When Big Ben strikes midnight on Friday, is the UK going to be in or out of the EU?
Let me look at the crystal ball. What's your best guess, Jim?
My best guess is out.
Out? Hard out on Friday.
You don't think the EU will give it an extension of time?
Well, I hope they will, but there are increasing pressures within Europe not to allow them
Macron for one.
an extension of time. The Europeans are pretty much fed up with the British, the British seem bent on economic suicide. And it's a shame. I'm the biggest Anglophile you could ever find, and I'm much distressed by it personally. Of course, they have to make their own decisions. We have enough challenges in our own country now with our government that we shouldn't be criticizing others. I think the likelihood is that at best it's going to delay the inevitable, because there's as bad as the deal Prime Minister May negotiated was and is, it's probably the best deal they're going to get.
So, Carla, is there going to be an extension, and will it be short term or long term? What do you think?
I would argue to the European Union there should be an extension. If you have Great Britain step aside and go out, what is that going to signal to Hungary, Poland, Italy? Is that going to be the beginning of a disintegration of a fantastic coalition that again came together after our horrible, horrible experience with war? And so let's be patient. Europe is no worse off by giving an extension than to have Europe on the outside and they're debating over rules, and one of the complaints is bureaucracy, and I think it would be a contagious kind of a situation. And you might just have others say, me too. Not a good statement.
I share that fear, but I also fear the British are running out of time.
Yes.
And they pushed it about as far as they can push it with the continent.
Well, I might argue, in answer to Carlos, that other countries, seeing what's been going on with Britain, the fiasco there, might want to think twice about whether they proceed out of the European Union, whether they jump out themselves. This has been a great discussion. I wish we had time for questions here, but we are very compacted on our time with this panel. So I want to thank our panelists for being up here, and I want to thank the audience for being part of it.